This lecture will introduce the currents and historical background that would lead to the advent of modernism. First, we must look at the age of absolutism in France, when, of course, France would be the capital of the art world under Louis XIV, and a new style would emerge to challenge his dictatorial French classical style. Turning to France, we have a very different situation than what we see in the Netherlands, where we have individuals that are celebrating their newfound country and religion. In France, we do not have the ruling system of government being a democracy. Instead, it is quite the opposite. You have absolutist monarchs here, like Louis XIV, who will move the capital from Paris to Versailles. And this is once again to reinforce the fact that he considers himself the Sun King. So Louis XIV, Louis XIV, is going to practice a form of monarchy known as absolutism. He consolidates all of the power that would have been shared with other nobles, other marquises, other dukes, other individuals in France helping him to rule. He takes all of their power and consolidates it, making him the center of the universe in France. Thus, he is the sun around which all other astral bodies revolve. Here we have a portrait of him indicating that rigid and hieratic style he prefers, thus illustrating the control he has over the French state. Just as Hyacinthe Rigaud, the painter here to the king, is going to show us how he has control over his medium, showing us this ermine fur-laced cloak, the crushed wonderful velvet with the fleur-de-lis brocaded on it, the jewel-encrusted sword here with the golden hilt, right? All of which showing us the power of the 63-year-old king who's going to be looking down on us, positioned above us. His elbow points out, separating us from him as his arm is akimbo, right? The richness and the wealth of the king shown in the finery surrounding him in this palace. The fleur-de-lis, just to show you, is going to be traced all the way back to Charlemagne. And like Charlemagne, Louis XIV wants to be a ruler that solely controls a vast empire, and wants to consolidate that power for himself and not sharing it with his brother Carloman, such as what Charlemagne did in the first years of his reign. Now, to reinforce the fact that we have a new type of government and a new king, Louis is going to move the capital to Versailles, which was the location for the royal hunting lodge. So you find that any kings who wanted to get out of the city and go hunting, which of course only royalty and nobility can go hunting because you have to own land to hunt the animals on that land. So he's going to transform this forest surrounding this royal hunting lodge into the largest palace that Europe had ever seen. And this becomes the single most expensive commission and architectural undertaking in the 17th century, being built from 1669 to 1685, in which we're going to find 3.5 square miles of raw woodlands is going to be torn down, cut down, and then trees replanted in nice, neat geometric rows. Everything centered around this city here of Versailles, where you'll have, again, the streets that are going to be coming together on the very bedroom of Louis, showing that he is the center of this new world, where we have 5,000 aristocrats living in the official palace at Versailles, with an additional 14,000 servants and military in the actual palace you see here. There are an additional 30,000 residents in the city of Versailles that still exist today in the southwest part of Paris. Now here is a photograph showing you just how massive this palace is. It's difficult to even get all of it in one photograph, whereby you have this horseshoe-shaped central section, which right in the middle, right on the top floor, you have Louis's bedroom overlooking this vast array of carefully manicured gardens and fountains. And then at his beck and call, right, thousands of aristocrats and servants. In this, you have 700 rooms in all that would be built at Versailles. 551,218 square feet total. A massive palace, right, even by the standards of today. So here we have the area that looks out onto the fountains and onto the gardens, where you would have a very famous gallery, the Galerie de Glace, which is going to overlook these extravagant, carefully manicured gardens. And the interior of Versailles would be decorated by the president of the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture in Paris, founded in 1648. This academy essentially was an arm of propaganda for the state, and Charles Lebrun was the chief artist overseeing all of these royal projects that reinforced the glories of Louis XIV. Visiting dignitaries would walk from their entry into the palace down past all of these mirrors in the Galerie de Glace, or the Hall of Mirrors, to the throne room of Louis, thus of course preparing them with this extravagant display of wealth for the powerful king, the most powerful king in Europe, as he would argue at the time. And France's power certainly is going to ascend, making them the capital of the art world by mid-century, and maintaining that status until we get to World War II. Of course, we need to address why mirrors would be so impressive to begin with. So here we have 17 mirror-clad arches, each one made up of 21 individual mirrors. Now you'll notice they are not very large, and that's because at the time this is as large of a mirror that you could make of high quality. So you find that the king had a mirror manufacturing plant moved literally from Venice to an area outside Versailles to do nothing but manufacture these mirrors in order to amaze the visitors that would come see him, because even aristocrats could not afford this many mirrors. This is an extravagant display, a sumptuous display of wealth, very extravagant. But of course, that is not the only room that should amaze us. Charles Lebrun is going to be the head of the French Academy and the main artist put in charge of decorating the entire palace. So every room, we must remember, would have been filled with very luxurious carved furniture, with paintings made to order for those rooms, with Venetian patterns on the walls, ceiling paintings and frescoes on each one. Architectural trompe-l'oeils built in, quadratura painted. Of course, you have chandeliers in every room, tapestries, rugs. So the decoration, we have to imagine, would have been spectacular before the French Revolution and the ransacking by the French people of Versailles. All of the interior decorations were based on the classicizing style and principles of that of Poussin, who is going to design by way of an architectonic schema, placing figures parallel to the picture plane, using primary sources or primary colors, as well as classical sources, and a didactic style, which is going to teach you a moral lesson and be edifying. Now, the inside isn't even the most impressive part by way of difficulty in transforming an area, in that we have all of these trees in this area completely leveled to the ground to make way for 200,000 trees that were planted in nice, neat rows. 50 fountains out here for the king and his aristocrats to wander in what they called a golden cage, to entertain them with lavish parties and entertainments so that they would forget that the king had taken away their power. In these well-manicured geometric gardens, we not only have rows and rows of these hedges, but also grottos, where natural formations and these springs would be carved into to create a getaway for the king. In this instance, we can see that surrounding the sculptural group, we have a colonnade, much like a classical temple front, carved directly into the rock itself. The subject of these various statues are going to glorify the king in mythological terms. Here we have Francois Girardon, one of the most important sculptors of the French classical Baroque age, and he's going to be responsible for the group of Apollo attended by nymphs. Now Apollo is the sun god, and we can see that he is at the center here at his toilette, as they would say, surrounded by these nymphs that serve gods and goddesses, washing him, washing his hands and feet, and serving his every need. Thus, we of course need to realize that Louis called himself the Sun King, for everything revolved around him. So here we have in mythological terms how he saw himself and the state revolving around him. The absolute power seen here is also represented by the absolute control in the French classical style preferred by Louis, which is not emotional but rationally argued, very clear in how it's represented. And thus we find that it is this style that the next generation will rebel against.
Now, the Rococo was only made possible thanks to the iron-fisted rule of Louis XIV, which is followed by a rather lackluster performance by his son Louis XV. So when Louis XIV, the Sun King, who had gathered all of the aristocrats and all of their power together in Versailles, exercising this absolutist rule and monarchy, he will die in 1715, leaving his 5-year-old son on the throne. Now, as one might imagine, a 5-year-old cannot rule alone, and so in these cases, we generally will appoint a regent. So this regent will rule in the place of a true monarch until they come of age. So this is the regency of Philip II of Orleans. And you find that Philippe II is going to, during the reign of Louis XV, rule for several years, thus giving the aristocrats the ability to regroup and to gain back the power and thus the wealth and money that they had lost under Louis XV's father. Now, celebrating this newfound wealth, aristocrats moved away from Versailles, what they considered to be the gilded cage that kept them preoccupied with the fact that they no longer had power and wealth in France. Now that they did have that back, they moved back into their townhomes in the city, and townhomes are going to be known as hôtels at this time. So not like our understanding of a hotel, but instead a mansion in a city, in Paris proper. So we have these aristocrats restructuring and refurbishing their new hotel with the latest style, which for them is going to express their newfound freedom and the regained power that they had after the demise of Louis XIV. So you find that on the exterior, to give you an example here at the Hôtel de Soubise, you find that we have the classical French Baroque facade with these paired columns that are common at Versailles and the Louvre, since the same architects designed them. So this is going to be the Baroque and the classical sense that the French appreciated. Turning to the interior, however, we have a radical departure from the logical and discerning style that was appreciated by Louis XIV. Here, we know this is refurbished after the death of Louis XIV, when these aristocrats are going to come back to Paris. And what they want in these small venues for informal social gatherings is a style that expresses that newfound freedom. And interestingly enough, intellectual curiosity and freedom as well, because it is in rooms like this where the Enlightenment will be born. Now, if you look at the room here, designed by Germaine Buffon, the Salon de la Princesse in the Hôtel des Soubise, you'll notice that, literally, the room of the princess is going to look just like it sounds. The style that is going to be adopted is going to be one of sumptuous, organic elegance, with these arabesques and gilded vegetal motifs that are going to ensure that we do not emphasize a tectonic display of rigid architectural rules and standards, but instead a free play between an engagement in, much like you saw with Bernini, paintings and then sculptures that spill out, and then the architectural decorations that move beyond the borders that are standard earlier. So you find that it is here we have where Rococo gets its name, because for the Baroque, literally from the Portuguese for misshapen pearl, we have a pejorative term for the style indicating how grotesque it is, how overly ornamented, and how dramatic it is. For the Rococo, it comes from a combination of roquelle and these coquilles, these shells ornaments that we see are all over the interior of the space. And remember that the Rococo is first an interior decorative style. It does not actually find its way into the fine arts until after this initial foray into Parisian high society. So you find that the repeated shapes can be seen throughout if you're looking carefully for these shell motifs where it gets its name, such as above the doorway here, right, and then above the frame here. So these are going to be gilt stucco. So we have stucco, is just much like plaster, is going to be added to the surface of the wall, building it up, and then it's going to be gold gilded, right? So that's where you get the gilt for gilt stucco, with these arabesque or whiplash-like patterns that move throughout, that are going to be blending from floor to ceiling seamlessly the design, which is going to be an exuberant one, celebrating above all, say, the loves of the gods in these panels that are painted here, and jouissance, right? So that being sensuous appreciation. So here, a celebration of the senses, we find that we are drawn from the walls up into the ceiling seamlessly, organically, because there is no differentiation, clearly, between ceiling and wall. So it's very different from the very organized, defined, refined, and controlled style appreciated by Louis XIV and carried out by his architects such as Jules Hardin Mansart and Charles Lebrun in the Galerie de Glace. Instead, now we find a free interplay, much like jazz, to where architects are going to have a basic design and then craftsmen will elaborate on that as it blends into and molds.
In these ceilings, where we have these vines growing up, we have a series of organically shaped panels, and this is going to be a series of paintings on the loves of Psyche. In this example, we have the story of Eros, or the god of love, in which he is going to fall in love with a mortal woman, Psyche, appropriate for the subject matter so common with Rococo art, centering around the loves of the aristocracy. In it, we can see here, such as with Natoi's example of Psyche illuminating Eros, that the mortal woman was forbade to actually see the god, and so he would come to her at night without the light. So he told her he could not bring a lamp, because it was forbidden that a god would have a relationship with a mortal woman. She disobeyed and showed exactly what he was, a god in his true divine form. Even though she disobeyed this divine mandate of not seeing a god in his divine form, we find that Eros, or Cupid, as he's otherwise known in the Roman vernacular, is going to be unable to live without her. So he convinces Zeus to grant her immortality, to become a divine being like him so they could live together forever. Here we find Venus, the goddess of love, in the lower left-hand corner, pointing upward. Behind her shoulder, we see Zeus and Hera on these clouds awaiting on Olympus, the apotheosis of Psyche here to join the gods. So here we can see the various manifestations that would be appropriate. In this instance, Psyche is going to represent the deification of the human soul for the Greeks. So we're clothing this erotic subject matter in, once again, something that is appropriately religious as well. But it still is going to relate to the loves of the aristocracy. So in the 18th century, what do we see here but a questioning of authority, whereby these other aristocrats were told not to do what Louis XIV had done, which was take all the power for himself. Therefore, Psyche's unwillingness to obey the gods and shine a light upon the truth of the matter, that she was in a relationship with a god, relates to the questioning in general that we find in this age of enlightenment, of scientific inquiry. In order to display this new interest both of the aristocracy and of the Enlightenment, we have a schism occurring here in the French Academy in the early 18th century between the followers of an older type of art that followed Nicolas Poussin, the Poussinists, who preferred form and rational argumentation and tectonic compositions, and a new guard that was going to be coming up, that is in the Rococo period, the Rubenists, those that followed the style of Peter Paul Rubens, one that is going to value color and emotion above all else. Therefore, we see this move to new subjects, glorifying the romances of the aristocracy, and a new style to go along with it, set early on in the century by the French Academy. So we see a shift from the rigid hierarchy that the monarchy preferred, which controlled things, to the jouissance, or the joy of life and living, of the broader aristocracy that took over.
That the Rococo artists are most closely going to be associated with. So here we have, as an introduction to the style, L'Indifferent, or the Indifferent One, by Antoine Watteau. And here we have a character in the Commedia dell'arte, very loosely painted, as is his gesture, very open and inviting. You have an improvisational comedy group that traveled the French countryside, performing to and for French aristocrats. So the comedy of art is Italian by its origin, and had stock characters that would play the hopeless romantic, the fool, right, the steadfast lover, etc. So here we have one of those characters, the indifferent one, with a type of graceful nonchalance. He turns to greet us, arms open, wearing this silk, right, outfit, with a warm cloak in an exterior space. Loosely painted in the opposite fashion as what we looked at that preceded the Rococo in France, and that is the French classical approach appreciated by Louis XIV, whereby everything is defined carefully and refined in such a way that we're communicating the status of Louis and his unapproachability, as he's going to be on an elevated platform, turning away from us, his elbow blocking us from entering the space as he looks down on us. On the contrary, we find that l'indifferent, the indifferent one here, painted by Watteau, is very loosely defined. His pose is open, warm, and inviting. And we find that the background, instead of being an interior palace communicating the rigid clarity of Versailles, we now are going to have the romance suggested by this garden scene. And so this is going to be familiar fundamental for the aspects of Rubens' art adopted by Rococo painters that will draw upon and appreciate landscape and romance, pulling upon our emotions and drawing us in by way of color relationships and of the power of the brushstroke instead of careful refinement. Now here we're going to have the reception piece for the French Academy, painted by Antoine Watteau, entitled The Pilgrimage to the Island of Cythera, from 1717 to 19, whereby we have him submitting this as part of his application for full admittance into the French Academy. So you would, of course, be given a subject and a time to complete it and brought back, and it would be reviewed by members of the Academy. Now, this was a genre that became so popular, they invented a new type of genre in order to explain it, in order to categorize it. So what do we have but aristocrats dressed in rustic attire have been spending the day on the island of love, that being the island of Cyprus, otherwise known, the Greek island, which is going to be the home of Venus, where she blows ashore from, once again, her birth in the ocean. So here we find aristocrats in couples are going to be getting up and heading back to the boat to return to reality, to leave the island of love. Now, because we have a landscape associated with romance, you have a new type that is inspired by the Pastoral Symphony that is in the same room as the Mona Lisa in the Louvre today. And so if you go look at it, the French title is not Pastoral Symphony. In fact, it is a fête champêtre. Otherwise known as a fête galante. This is going to be a gallant party and or a gathering of aristocrats in the countryside for romantic activities. And this is a very popular genre among aristocrats in the early 18th century who have just taken their power back from Louis XIV and are asserting the one thing that is unique to aristocrats, and that is the ability to own land. They are the landed gentry, and the ability to appreciate leisure. Obviously, if you're going to be a merchant or in the middle class, or if you're a peasant, you don't have time to just lay about all day and once again read poetry or sing to one another or court, for instance. So this is a new category added because of Watteau and the popularity of the type of painting. So all the way at the right, we already have established from the Venetian tradition that landscapes are a romantic setting, that we have associated with them the effects that would be rendered on the viewers and on the participants who go out into the countryside for picnics, for romantic dalliances and rendezvous. Right, so we have that here in this romantic setting, starting at the far right, where we have a statue of Venus covered in roses, her official flower, with a quiver and bow beneath it, the symbol for her son in the Roman tradition, Cupid, whereby you see this Puto, this little Cupid-like figure, tugging at the woman's dress here as a man whispers sweet nothings into her ear, beckoning her to stay on the island of love and enjoy more of these carnal pleasures they've enjoyed all afternoon, celebrating jouissance, or the celebration of sensuous pleasure. The next set of couples looks back fondly as they help one another to their feet, gathering their walking sticks, heading to the boat with their dogs in tow. And then finally, you're going to have the putti with torches because they're lighting the flames of passion flying in the air. Now, how we move through this painting is very telling for the Rococo, because unlike the classical painting of Nicolas Poussin, in which we move through it very rigidly, very deliberately, plane by plane, based around a grid-like design, now we have this organic fluidity that offsets this tectonic classicism, whereby to move from foreground right down with the figures to the boat, we have the same type of international Gothic appreciation of elegant rhythms and serpentine-like, dance-like rhythms. Below with Poussin, you'll notice that the composition is based around verticals and horizontals. There are no straight lines, though, in a Rococo painting. Everything is going to be designed much like those arabesque whiplash patterns and vegetal motifs that are going to make up the interior of their hotel, as he is going to die of syphilis and she will commit suicide. Now, this negative approach to an interpretation of aristocratic excess is certainly a counterpoint to what we see continuing in France. Now, if you look at the official mistress to Louis XV, Madame de Pompadour, you have one of the most important art patrons in France in the 18th century. She will commission, and as her official painter, she will commission Francois Boucher, right, who is going to be a very popular Rococo painter who celebrates the excesses of the aristocracy. So you find that Madame de Pompadour introduces Boucher to Louis XV, right, her lover, and he becomes the first painter to the king in 1765, producing both mythological and erotic works for the private enjoyment of the king and for Madame de Pompadour.
Returning to the Hôtel de Soubise that we looked at a moment ago, here we have in a bedchamber an appropriate subject for courtship. Here, by Francois Boucher, we have the Gracious Shepherd of 1736 to 39. In it, we have the man presenting a little bird in a cage, which is the first phase of courtship at this time. This is going to relate to the leading her to be captured by love like the bird is captured in the cage. The setting is idyllic. It is a pastoral escapist fantasy, appropriate for the aristocracy who, by definition, was allowed to appreciate leisure, to go off into the countryside, to take time away from work in the city. Thus, we find this idealization of country life. Boucher was of course known for his scenes of love and sex, like the one seen here of Mars and Venus surprised by Vulcan. The subject matter itself is one of a philandering couple, whereby we find Venus is married to Vulcan, the god of the forge, who catches his wife cheating on him with Mars, the god of war, seen here in this bed together at the left. Therefore, this is meant to reflect the sensual pleasures of the aristocracy in mythological terms. As one moves through, we see this exaggerated Baroque interest in dramatic movement as we move side to side in this zigzag fashion. We have a light and airy palette with these pastel colors, and once again, the mood is always lyrical and idyllic. So here, these voluptuous figures are going to be used to showcase this erotic subject that is lighthearted and also playful, even though we're looking at a scene of, once again, a philandering wife, someone who's cheating and cuckolding her husband. It still relates overall to the themes of love that are common at this time that aristocrats preferred. Here, if we look carefully, you can see the fleshy nature of the brushwork that celebrates this jouissance, as it will become known, this love of life, of playfulness, of sex in this way. The organic composition in both of the examples we've already cited point to a celebration of this Baroque exuberance, that being taken, this idea that was first developed for a religious context of celebrating religion and of the soul joining once again God in heaven, and using it now for a corporal context, for a sexual and erotic one, and celebrating the loves of the aristocracy.
Now, another example carrying on a straightforward secular scene whereby we have an aristocrat and his lover, a mistress in a garden setting. Obviously, in this intrigue painting, an illicit rendezvous is what we're looking at. We give you Jean-Honoré Fragonard's The Swing. So the swing, again, is going to be painted by a pupil of Chardin and Boucher, so the painter we just looked at, and he is a winner of the Prix de Rome. So we find that, as always in these surveys, we only show you the most successful artists. And the Prix de Rome, or the Prize of Rome, illustrates that and speaks to it because it is a scholarship given out annually in the French Academy, whereby artists compete to study in Rome, to live and work there for several years. So only the best receive this sponsorship of the royal court. Now here in an intrigue painting, or a painting designed to intrigue the viewer by drawing it into some illicit subject, in this case the illicit nature is going to be spelled out clearly by the patron, Gabriel Francois Doyon, who is going to state that he wants his mistress painted, quote, on a swing which a bishop is set in motion. You will place me in a position in which I can see the legs of the lovely child, and even more if you wish to enliven the picture, end quote. So we find here that the mistress is on the swing tied to a tree with a bishop and shadows to the back middle ground right. And then directly below her in her pastel dress we have two sculptures of wrestling putti or cupids. And then finally in the lower left you find the patron himself, Doyon, who's going to be pulling back the flowering bushes with his hat, gazing up the skirt of his mistress. The intriguing nature of the painting is illustrated to us by the sculpture of Cupid above the hiding patron here, who is not seen in the bushes by the mistress or the bishop, whereby he holds his hands to his lip. We are meant to look at the Cupid because the mistress here kicks her shoe off at his head. So we are drawn towards him in the lightest area of the painting. The mistress wearing a very warm colored dress, this warm cream pastel color, whereby the light is going to cascade through the open branches of this wooded scene, illuminating what is happening. And remember, these are very small paintings meant to be seen in private settings like bedrooms. And here, if you look at the expression of the patron, he is obviously very enthused and very excited at what he sees, gazing up the legs, as he states, of his mistress. She, in a light-hearted, playful fashion, smiles and kicks, right, in this way, obviously suggesting the illicit rendezvous that's going to occur next when he presents himself to his lover in this garden scene. Now, the idea of having a wooded aristocratic scene that's going to bring together the loves of the aristocracy goes back to the painting that is going to establish this fête galante tradition, this gallant party tradition, and that's Watteau's
Another example by Fragonard, The Progress of Love, which is a series from 1771 to 73, also shows us this love of aristocrats in gardens. Here we have 4 panels for Madame de Berry and the last mistress of Louis XV. In this one, we have the third category, which is a contemporary scene, not one of mythological subjects, not one of the gods or of a historical scene, but instead people dressed in attire that you would see during this time and engaged in activities like courtship rituals that we could see at this time. So here in the series, we see a couple that would meet together. In this instance, the secret meeting has the woman making sure that her chaperone didn't follow her, while the man climbing a ladder over this garden, which remember is always going to be a stand-in for a woman's chastity, a woman's body in this way. So he's scaling the garden, the parapet here, with again Venus and Cupid overseeing it. So we know this is an illicit rendezvous, much like in The Swing. Here we can see that he has come to see his sweetheart, and this illicit rendezvous is going to be titillating in the same way that The Swing would be for a private viewing, for a private audience. So here comparing it, what do we have but the same zigzag type pattern, light airy brushwork, an emphasis on pastel colors, and subjects of contemporary people in contemporary attire engaged in courtship and the love of the wealthy. The subjects in the Rococo move beyond painting. Here, Falconet is going to create a sculpture for Madame de Pompadour again, the patron of Boucher. In his seated Cupid, we have a roughly life-size, childlike statue, which is carved at the base Falconet fecit, or this artist Falconet made this. Here, the Cupid is going to have its finger pulled to its lips, as we find an arrow is being pulled from the quiver with his left hand. Thus, of course, showing us there is something illicit about to occur. He's going to make people fall in love who should not, thus people who are not married. So here we become an accomplice to this attack by unwittingly not saying anything and not warning a woman or a man who's about to be shot by Cupid's arrow, much like we saw with Cupid to the left, whereby the woman kicks her shoe up at him, who also is in the same position. Another example of the type of tabletop sculpture that one would see in these townhomes in Paris is by Clodion in his Nymph and Satyr of 1775. Now, Clodion is a winner of the Prix de Rome, or the Prize of Rome, which is a scholarship by the French Academy to go study abroad in Italy. And only the best artists who participate and win this competition get this fully paid scholarship. Now here we have a terracotta table piece that would meant to be seen in these domestic interiors, surrounded by the paintings of the loves of the gods and of the aristocracy we've been discussing. In this instance, we have a satyr, which represents the male lustful component of nature in ancient Greek mythology, who is half man, half goat, who is being tackled here by a nymph, the female spirits of the woods associated with fresh spring water, who are going to serve goddesses.
From Cythera. Now here, the counterpart in painting can be seen in sculpture with Clodion. Clodion is one of the greatest Rococo sculptors of the day, who also wins the Prix de Rome, like Fragonard we just looked at, spending time studying in Rome, and while there he is very impressed by Gian Lorenzo Bernini, and especially the statues in the Borghese Palazzo, which is now known as the Borghese Gallery, that Bernini produces for Scipione Borghese early in his career in the 1620s. So here we have a small terracotta table piece that is designed as a conversation piece to be seen in the salons that we looked at, like the Salon de la Princesse. So this is where you would see these types of works. And we must remember that the interior of these hotels, such as the Hôtel de Soubise in Paris, would have been lavishly decorated. And we must remember that in the French Revolution, the revolutionaries go into these townhomes and ransack them, murdering their occupants, destroying the furniture, melting down the gold that they found, ripping up paintings and burning them. So the furniture is missing, but would have been completely filling this room in the gold gilded stucco design that we see on the walls. So the design here and the subject is actually one of courtship, but cast in mythological terms. A very popular subject in the Rococo era with aristocrats, in which we often find paintings like that by Fragonard illustrating the courtship rituals of aristocrats chasing after women, and generally showing women moving away from and resisting the charms of the aristocrats, because in manuals written during the day that would increase the delight of both parties if she would resist for a long period of time. Thus the conquest is ever more fruitful and worthwhile. Now you'll notice that in the Nymph and Satyr we have the reverse of this scenario, in which the nude woman or nymph, these are going to be mythological women who are going to represent fresh water and or springs. So they're also going to serve goddesses. And in mythology, they are chased very often in forests by the representation of male libido, of raw sexual desire, desire, and that is a satyr. So here we have the satyr, the half man, half goat, who instead of chasing this nymph is himself tackled by her as she holds up a goblet of wine, intoxicating him, thus not passively seducing him, but actively doing so. Now, the form that we see here is actually adopted from Apollo and Daphne by Bernini in the Borghese Gallery, where you find a male figure is going to be chasing and grabbing a female figure who is transforming, in this case, into a tree, a myrtle tree. Now, in this instance, we're meant to relate the two and think about how the Rococo is going to take from that exuberance of the Baroque, but not in a religious sense, right? Taking it in a secular meaning and setting. We have here a conversation piece that would be very interesting to aristocrats, bringing up the question, what if a woman were the aggressor in a courtship ritual? What if they were going to be the ones that sought after and chased after men? Wouldn't that be titillating, as they would understand it? Now, at the same time, we should note that the Rococo takes the Baroque to its extreme, whereas in Bernini, the twisting forms are going to be halting in space because Daphne anchors into the ground by way of the roots growing from her feet, the branches growing from her fingers. And so we find that this upward momentum halts them vertically. In Clodion, the balance is lacking. So we find that the unstable left arm of the satyr is going to buckle and give way as he is intoxicated, and the weight of the nymph is going to overpower him, and they will fall down together in this romantic tryst, this illicit rendezvous in the forest, just as you would have aristocrats who are going to the forest in order to have picnics and to court one another and to, once again, have extramarital affairs. So the Rococo can be defined and was seen by the middle class as aristocratic excess, as once again celebrating what they were able to do as aristocrats and what they saw themselves as defined by as aristocrats. So here we continue that Venetian approach that is going to relate the romance associated with landscapes, with amorous trysts. You go out into the countryside to enjoy carnal pleasures and jouissance. And here we communicate that celebration of the flesh dramatically with a type of exaggerated Baroque exuberance, building compositions around diagonals, and completely dismissing the grid-like construct of earlier French classicism.
Next class, we'll continue on with what happens with the Enlightenment and the influence of the Rococo coming out of France outside of it, specifically looking at England and painters such as Sir Joshua Reynolds.